Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, Quilt National 2025, which is produced and circulated by the Dairy Barn Arts Center in Athens, Ohio. Today, we are thrilled to present the artist Mary Lou Alexander. But before we begin, just a brief reminder. So everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode, but do feel free to ask questions using the chat. We'll be sure to get to those at the end of the talk during the Q&A session. And also, please keep in mind that because we are presenting from separate locations, there may be some variation in bandwidth. So if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thank you in advance for bearing with us. And with that, let's go ahead and get things started. So please welcome Mary Lou Alexander.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Pinata, for all your help. Um, Welcome, everyone. And I'm Mary Lou Alexander. I'm an art quilter from Northeastern Ohio. And I'd like to show you some of the work that I've been doing for about the last 25 years or so. But first, just a little background. And in my first career, I was a biological anthropologist, and I studied some small New World primates. Um, these are photos. This is a common marmoset on the left, a cotton-top tamarin on the right, and that's me on the right, in the middle, and that's me on the right. Um, about 25 years ago, I decided to quit my tenured professorship at Kent and become a full-time fiber artist. Um, However, I brought some of my science with me and some of the patterns that I use, some of the um, principles that I used when I was a scientist. And the first one was repetition. And in science, if you see something that's repeated over and over, it becomes interesting, whether it's an object or a behavior or maybe an event. Um, when you see that over and over, it becomes a pattern. So in this quilt that I made, you can see that the repetition is the square, lots and lots of squares over and over. The squares are arranged eventually into a pattern, and you can see those cross patterns that each that form a pattern all over the quilt. Finally, in science, variation from a pattern makes it really interesting. And here in this quilt, the variation that I've applied to my art is variation in size. So this quilt would have been a lot more, or is a lot more interesting than it would have been had all the squares been the same size, or all the squares been arranged without variation in color. Finally, in science, one is expected to share your results, the results of your research. Um, this is because your work may inspire or enhance the work of somebody else. And so it's vital that you show what you do. Don't keep it to yourself in your lab. I feel the same thing about art. I think it's vital that you share what you're doing. It may inspire somebody else. Um, it may enhance their work. So these four things kind of have guided my work over the last 25 years. Okay. Oh, all right. In terms of influences, there were three people who have had really profound influence on my work and on my life. Um, the first on the right, sorry, the left is Yoshiko Wada. Yoshiko is probably the foremost ambassador for shibori dye techniques and Japanese needlework generally in the world. I was lucky enough to take a class from her very early in my career, and it kind of changed the course of my work. She remains a really profound inspiration. Nancy Crow in the center. Nancy, I've been taking classes from her for about 25 years, and she's become a important mentor, teacher, and also a very dear friend over the years. Um, Finally, on the right is a painting by my friend Jim Lucas. Jim was a professor of painting at Youngstown State University here in Youngstown, and he he his primary thing was painting. He didn't look for fame and fortune. He didn't show all that frequently. He did, but not all that frequently. And Lou Zona, the director of the Butler Institute of American Art, described Luke as the very best painter that you never heard of, okay, because painting was the point for him. He was my husband's dear friend, and he would come to dinner at our house for many years on a weekly basis. And after dinner, we'd go downstairs and he would into my studio and he would critique my work. And sometimes it was quite brutal, and sometimes it was very sweet, and always it was very useful. Oh, most of my work has three things in common. Um, I work pretty exclusively with hand-dyed fabric or hand-painted fabric, either one, that I do myself. Um, I usually take that fabric and cut it up and rearrange it, reassemble it. So my work is almost always machine pieced and almost always machine quilted. There's a few exceptions, but that's pretty much how it goes. Um, Finally, the work that I'm going to show today especially relies on shibori techniques. I've done other work, but I'm going to concentrate today on shibori. And shibori is a mechanical resist form of dyeing, which means that unlike batik, where you might use a wax or something like that, with shibori you use purely mechanical means. This is a illustration. This illustrates that I've taken the fabric and wrapped it around a tube. This is a sewer pipe in this case. Um, then over that, wrapped yarn or string around it tightly, and then scrunched it to one end of the fabric and that or of the tube, and then dipped the tube into a dye pot. This means that where the fabric is adheres to the tube, the dye can't penetrate. Where the fabric is loose on the outer edge, there the fabric does, and this produces a pattern on the fabric. Pretty much a striped fabric in this case. This is called a rashi shibori, this method, but there's other methods, and I'll show a few of them. Here's some early work of mine using this arashi shibori technique. The top left is probably the simplest method of shibori, where it's just scrunched up and dipped in a pot. So there's just an uneven and unpredictable distribution of dye on the fabric. The one on the upper right is a very simple arrangement of the stripes that the shibori technique or the arashi technique allows or produces. The two on the bottom show a much more complex arrangement of, it means that I have cut up the striped fabric, rearranged it into much more complex arrangements, and turned it into these art quilts. The one on the lower right, I think, one of my favorites. It's a sunset, obviously. Okay. This Arashi technique got me into Quilt National way back in 2009 with this quilt called Glacier. And I'm still hoping to get in again. It hasn't happened, but I'm confident that it will in the future. These Arashi quilts also were chosen by Nancy Crow to be part of her first exhibition called Color Improvisations. She's done two since then, but this was the very first one back in 2010, and it was opened in Stuttgart, Germany. This is the opening of the opening. They're opening the door there for people to go in. Some of you might recognize some of the people in that photo. And here are the two quilts that she included in that exhibition. The one on the right is called Aurora Borealis, and the one on the left is called Limnos Benthos. Now, both of those were inspired by my interest in the natural world. The first real series that I worked on using shibori techniques, I call the Justice series. And it was inspired by the beautiful quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Uh, said, "We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." Just love that quote. And the work that came out of that idea was meant to represent a more or less suggest really a waterfall. So this is justice number 2. And for justice number 2 and for some of the others in this series, I used a variation on the Arashi Shibori technique. Rather than a tube, I used a large diameter nautical rope. It was wrapped the fabric around it and then scrunched it and then added it to the dye bath. And as you might be able to see, it produces a kind of a mottled or watery technique rather than the stripes that the Arashi Shibori produced. This is number 6, Justice number 6. And I included this one, again, part of the Justice series, uh, to sort of illustrate that inspiration can come from anywhere. The photograph on the left is a photograph that I took in southern France at an ochre mine where they dug this colored dirt essentially and made it into paints and yeah, paints. Okay. Um, that's my friend Susanna walking down the path in her blue dress. And the quilt that resulted from this, or was the interpretation of this photo in a quilt, is the one on the right. This is Justice number 11, I think. Um, anyway, I mimic the colors of the photograph, and there's Susanna's blue dress becomes the waterfall. This is the final one in the series, and Justice number 11. Again, they became increasingly loose, increasingly more water-like as the series progressed. Another major series that followed is the Things Fall Apart series. And like most people, I'm kind of distressed at uh, how much discord there is among people in the world today. Um, this reminded me of a poem by William Butler Yeats uh, that was called The Second Coming. And in the middle of the poem, he says, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The best lack all conviction, and the worst are full of passionate intensity." And this poem was written in 1921, but I feel and felt at the time when I started this series that it could have been written today, and it remains so. Here are the 3 beginning quilts in this series. Um, this was in this series, I started to use a new piecing technique that I hadn't used before. And it means that I use an inset rather than applique. They look sort of as though they're appliqued onto the background fabric, but they're not. They're actually, the background fabric is actually cut into. This means that you have to sew yourself into a corner and then somehow sew yourself back out. It's kind of tricky, but it's really engaging. It's difficult, and I've ruined a lot more than one piece trying to get to this success, but somehow it keeps me interested and keeps me engaged. These 3 are called Things Fall Apart. It's number 2, I think, on the left, number 5 and 6, moving to the right. These are using that modeled variation on the Arashi technique for dyeing. These were chosen by Nancy Crow for another exhibit called Material Pulses that actually opened here at the Rife Gallery. Um, it was in 2016, and there were 8 artists invited to participate in this show. I was actually really thrilled and honored to be part of it. It toured the United States for, I think, 3 or 4 years uh, at universities and commercial galleries. Here's an installation view of the opening at the Rife Gallery. You can see these quilts were big. These were all about 80 inches squared. And the point here was Nancy wanted the splendor of the essentially bed-sized quilt to be seen by all the artists. Okay, here was an unexpected invitation. The owner of a grocery store in Greene, Ohio, the Acme Green, invited Nancy and asked her to bring some student work and to use in his grocery store. So images, not the quilts themselves, but the images were used along the frozen foods aisle of the store. His whole store was kind of a quilt theme, but many of Nancy's, or several of Nancy's students were included in this. So, and one of my things fall apart made it too. I always think that I was big in frozen foods here. A few years ago, more recently, I revisited this idea of things fall apart. And again, the longer or the more pieces I put into a series, usually the more complex it gets, and that's pretty evident here. This one is called Things Fall Apart number 8. It's about 55 inches square, so it's smaller but more complex than the earlier pieces. Explosion imagery, again, more complex. Here's a close-up of the both the quilting on this, but also on the insets, and you can see how the background material is cut into, and the piece is stitched into it, not applique on top. And here's another one in that series. This is number 9, and it's about the same size, about 56 inches square. Okay, another series. This one is called Geometry of the Herd, and it's not um, it's not inspired by a poem. It's inspired by actually a scientific paper that was very influential in my research. It was called The Geometry for the Selfish Herd, and it was written by W.D. Hamilton, who was an evolutionary biologist, and he published it in 1971. Um, much more recently, I took a trip to South Africa, and I took a lot of photos of the wildlife. And you may by now recognize that I really like stripes. So the zebras were of special interest to me. And here was a photo I took of a herd of zebras, just 2 actually made it into the photo. Um, this photograph I made a silk screen, a photo silk screen of. And I used that to make a number of quilts, taking that same photo and another one, similar one, by printing repeats of that photo onto this fabric and rearranging those photos or those printed fabrics. I was able to make variation in the interest. Okay. Here, same idea. I was printing onto shibori printed fabric that was already colored, printed the black and white photo onto it. This is an illustration of how the patterns start to make secondary patterns. So in the lower right, you can see there's sort of that square shape with the projections coming from it. And that's kind of an accident of the repeat photos. Here's another one on an indigo ground. Again, an indigo dyed fabric. And there's sort of that star shape in the middle that emerged when I was putting those pieces together. I really like that idea of secondary patterning. Another one um, in that series. And this was the third one in the or the final one in the series. It's quite large. It's those others were about 40 inches square. So this one is much larger, about 68 inches square. This one I submitted to a Studio Art Quilt Associates uh, exhibition, and it happened to open down at it was called, I love the name of this one. It was called, I have to read this so I get it right, Fur, Fangs, Feathers, and Fins. Okay, and it was opened at the Sonoran, uh, Sonoran Desert Botanic Garden down in Tucson, Arizona. And it then traveled around. It went to Korea, to a quilt festival in Korea. It went to Oklahoma State University, and it finally ended up at the Detroit Zoo before it came home. Okay, in about 2015, 2016, I started to become interested in natural dyes. Natural dyes are those that are derived from plants or from, in a few cases, from insects. Um, and these are pretty different from the fiber reactive dyes that I had been using previously, in that they require a lot more work. First of all, you have to mordant the fabric, which means apply a solution of usually a metal like aluminum or iron to the fabric first, and then use or apply the dye. The dye usually also has to be heated to a regular, a high temperature, but not boiling. So it's a little picky, it's a little fussy to use natural dyes, but they do produce some pretty gorgeous colors. Because of the heating issue, I didn't want to use my kitchen stove, and my husband was happy about that. And I didn't want to invest in expensive steaming equipment, which is available out there, but it's quite expensive. So I started using a 100 cup coffee maker and was able to, this was meant I was able to heat the dye solution to a constant temperature, about 160 degrees, and then maintain that temperature over a long time without it cooling off and becoming less effective. So this was a great, relatively inexpensive solution to the heating uh, issue. And also it kept my kitchen, or the messy dyes away from my kitchen. This is an example of one of the early pieces. The central area is dyed in indigo, a plant material that's originally was used to dye blue jeans. It's used up pretty much all over the world now for many different applications. And the outer section, the red, was dyed with madder, which is a root of a plant. Um, Madder was also used back during the Revolutionary War to dye the redcoats red. Here's a detail of that same piece showing all the stitching that I did which was really kind of fun to do. That's a seed stitch. Another naturally dyed quilt. This one I called Nighttown. And this used many different dyes. The very top there, the blue was an indigo. The upper right and lower left that were done with madder. Um, then that pink color in the middle, the upper middle, and the lower left, lower right, sorry, were done with cochineal, which is an insect that is ground up and produces the kind of that pinky, kind of fuchsia colored. From It's an insect that infests some cactuses in Mexico, Central America, in very hot areas. The pale yellow is done with something called weld, an herb, and the darker yellow, that orangey yellow, is done with the root of a tree called the Osage orange tree. So there's many, many, many different natural dyes. The ones I stuck to were really those that were the most light fast, and those are the ones represented here. Here's another quilt called Nighttown #2. These both were meant to suggest, at least, the evening or nighttime sky in a city, with the lights. And these were invited to be part of an exhibit that was part of a symposium. The symposium was held in the oldest house in North America, or probably in the United States, down in St. Augustine, Florida. And the symposium was called Deeper Than Indigo, and it focused on the effect of the indigo trade on economics, on the culture, and on the arts in the southern U.S. I just love the walls in this particular building. And this is a photo of my friend Peggy Cox. Peggy was a painter, a gardener, and a dyer extraordinaire. She was professor at Westminster University in Pennsylvania, a very dear friend of mine, and she taught me pretty much everything I know about natural dyeing. Um, um, she was mad for it. She just it really kind of ruled her life. This is one of her works. She used a technique called botanical printing, which is in which she would take a piece of leaf or flower, place it on the fabric, subject the fabric to a chemical and a heat process, and it would transfer the image of that piece of botany, essentially, onto the cloth. She was able to get some colors that I've not seen other people be able to get. They were really beautiful. Uh, and here's a close-up. After she did the dyeing, then Peggy would stitch, embroider, essentially, the quilts extensively, very heavily embroidered. Very beautiful. She and I were able to put together a duo exhibition that was called Botanical Threads at Fellows Riverside's Gardens in Youngstown, Ohio, and then it moved on to the Foster or the not the Foster Gallery, sorry. Yeah, the Foster Gallery at Westminster University over in Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, Peggy passed away just as the show was opening, and I inherited a lot of her studio materials, a lot of the fabric that she had dyed. I made this quilt of her botanic dyed fabric. And I always think of it as, I called it threnody, which is a term used as a poem of praise for the dead. I see the larger square in the middle of being her, the one who knew the techniques, and the little one at the bottom was me, the student. This is a close-up of her fabrics. I just thought they were so beautiful. They reminded me a lot of fossils, um, the impressions that plant material might leave on a rock, but incredible detail. Okay, moving on. Um, Metamorphosis series. All growth is a leap in the dark, a spontaneous, premeditated act without benefit of experience. Um, this series began when I was lucky enough to attend the International Shibori Symposium in Japan in 2018. During that symposium, which was about 3 weeks long, we were able to take a lot of workshops, and one of them was at the Kuno Dye Works in Arimatsu, Japan, which is kind of a shibori village. Um, Mr. Kuno himself, Kuno-san himself, uh, showed us how to produce 3D effects using shibori on fabric. So it wasn't just not just a dye class, it was also producing 3D. This is a satin, polyester satin piece that he showed us. Here's another of his techniques. He had many, many techniques of producing different 3D effects on fabric. This was my interpretation, or how I used what I learned. This is called New Growth. It was the first in this Metamorphosis series. And growth in this series kind of had two meanings. One was these things looked like they were some sort of biological growth. They had this silk straw hair coming off of them. They were made with silk organza. And they were shaped by tying the fabric, the organza, around dice, playing dice, and submitting it to a heat process. In Mr. Kuno's case, he used polyester, and the steam produced a permanent change in the fabric shape. Okay, you couldn't get rid of it. You couldn't hit it with a fire hose and get rid of it. With silk, it's less permanent, but it's as long as it doesn't get wet, it retains the shape of the whatever object it was wrapped around. Also, this new shibori work was appliqued onto some old quilt fabrics of mine, things that I wasn't using anymore or weren't what I was thinking about anymore. So it kind of represents growth from an old technique into a new one for me. And here's a close-up of those cubes that fabric, that organza was able to take from the dice shape underneath. I did again, a whole series of these, that all of them called growth or metamorphosis, are part of the metamorphosis. This one is metamorphosis 3, I think. Um, it also has that hair-like effect, which echoes the idea of growth. Again, applique to an older quilt fragment. Another one. In this one, I changed the size of the cubes that the organza was formed around, and I used a wooden block plus dice plus several sizes of wooden blocks to vary that. Again, variation on a theme. This is one of my favorites. It's the name of it. This quilt is "Sun's Gonna Shine in My Back Door Someday," and it's from that tune, that blues song, "Trouble in Mind." And I made this in what I think of as a fit of optimism back during COVID. But again, that background piece, an old quilt, and the shibori, the shaped shibori appliqued onto it. In this one, I think I didn't use the silk straw for those kind of stringy things that are hanging off of it. I used silver embroidery thread. This one is called Flotsam, again, using variation in size. This one, I did not use an old quilt. I made a purpose-built quilt or purpose-made quilt out of white silk um, and embroidered or appliqued the shibori pieces onto it. Close up. And for in terms of showing this series, I was lucky enough to be invited to have an article in Art Quilt Quarterly, and they decided to put it on the cover. So at my advanced age, I became a cover girl. Okay, more 3D and a different technique. This almost uses both the shibori technique and the sashiko technique of Japanese stitching. This starts with a square of fabric. In this case, in all three cases, they were pieced together different colors. Okay, but it started as a large square. Then it was stitched with what would really be a sashiko stitch, just a running stitch in rows. And then the fabric or the strings, the thread was pulled tight, and that changed the shape of the fabric. It also gave this very folded, dense folded surface. These three are called fandango, which is what was it called? A frivolous or useless thing. Here's another one in that 3D idea. You can see the stitching in the rows because instead of pulling all of them as tight as possible, like in the other three, I really just left some loose, okay, so that they changed it wasn't the same shape all the way around. With this one too, because it was a very large piece, I had to harden the fabric with a hardener, a kind of a glue, so that it's a stiff piece that can be hung on a wall. Oh, this one is called She Just Loves to Dance. And the final one, this one you can really see the stitching in. Again, used a hardener on this because it's quite large, and I called it the Embrace. Evelyn Penman, the curator at St. Bonaventure University in upstate New York, saw my work on Instagram, and she called and invited me to do a solo show at her gallery. Um, I say this because I cannot stress enough how important Instagram and social media can be in getting your work out there. She chose 30 pieces of my work and hung it in the gallery. I did a little talk. I did a demo with the students, like a little workshop with students, and it was really an excellent opportunity. I really had a great time doing it, and I was thrilled to see my work all presented together. Here's one view of the installation and another view of that same installation. Finally, coming up to the Luminous series. This is a series, this most recent series that I've been working on the past year and a half or so. I have 20 pieces um, in this series, and it's in this series I was trying to examine light, the effects of light and reflection. First one just called Luminous. In this one, I used for the first time, I used a reflective paint, a metallic acrylic paint on top of hand-dyed material. I was really trying for a simple composition, this square and square, about as simple as you can get. Um, and a very complex surface design. So this fabric was wrapped on the pole, painted rather than dyed with the reflective acrylic paint, and then removed from the pole, rewrapped in a different direction, and painted again. So I got this very complex, kind of unpredictable or random patterning on the fabric. In addition, I was trying to work with values, very close values and very high contrast values. So a lot of things going on in this quilt. Um, the series, the ones that follow are all somehow different from one another. They don't just differ in their colorways, but they differ in how the paint was used, how it was arranged. And like I said, there are about 20 of them. Most of them are around 40 inches square. It's another one, again, that very close value. It almost fades, one fades into the other, and then a high contrast, very reflective centerpiece. Close up of that. Here's luminous number 2. That last one was new luminous number 3. In this one, it was I did not do a second painting, a second rewrap and paint. I just used one. And again, this is pulling up those secondary patterns that show up, these kind of diamond-shaped patterns because of the arrangement of the pieced squares. One of my favorites. I love how this metallic color, just that center metallic piece just kind of blends or emerges from the surrounding beige and yellow. This is number 4. Number 7. In this one, I was playing with transparency, looking at how the value changes might appear to make that central square emerge or recede, depending on the color behind it. Also, those secondary patterns emerge in this one quite well, I think. Here things got really loose, number of different colors involved, and that central square started wandering around the middle of the quilt. Here, two or three things are going on, but those diamond patterns really are starting to form almost a tile color or tile pattern. And that center square is starting to pixelate or to kind of explode from its center. This is number 10. And again, all of these have been about 40 inches square. In this one, this is number 12, and it is the first one in which I started outlining each of the marks made by the paint with a pen. So this was, again, the same central square and square idea, again, playing with value, but each of those little marks made by the paint was outlined in pen. This took forever. This was incredibly intensive in terms of work. However, I really enjoyed it. It was really fun to do, and I continued to do it in the rest of the quilts in this series. This is my favorite painting or my favorite photo of all time. This quilt was shown at the Quilt Equals Art Equals Quilt show up at the Schweinfurth up in Central New York, the Schweinfurth Art Center. And this happened. Someone from the Schweinfurth took this photo of this little guy looking at my quilt and happened to post it on social media. And I saw it there. I didn't know this child. I didn't know the person who took the picture, but I was really delighted that she posted it and that I got to see it. It was just one of my favorite photos. I just love how he's engrossed. Again, here comes more pixelations. This one is, I think, number 16. This is number 18. This was just opened in the Art Quilt Elements show over at the Wayne Art Center over by Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. I'm starting to really love these inset uh, squares, these little sparkles. I think of them as sparkles. And they are all inset. They're not, again, not appliqué. Again, the final one in the series, this one just was accepted into Best of Ohio down at the Ohio uh, um, Craft Museum, which opens, I think, in May. And I thought it was going to be the last one in the series, but I'm so enamored now of these little pixelations, these insets, that I think I'll probably do a few more because they're just so much fun. One more Instagram story. The curator, Aldona Bird, at the Monongalia Art Center down in West Virginia in Morgantown, saw my work on Instagram again and invited me to participate in a show that she was putting together a couple years ago. And then last fall, she asked if I would do a solo show down at her art center. And I was thrilled to say yes. Um, this this was a chance to see all of my luminous quilts that were finished at the time, all of them in one place, and they were all glowing together in the Monongalia Art Center. It was a very nice show. This shows one view of the installation and another view. There was also a third wall that I didn't get a photograph of. Okay, but it was really a treat, and I'm very grateful to Aldona for inviting me. Again, I can't stress strongly enough the importance of its Instagram specifically and social media generally in getting your work out there. This has resulted in several shows for me, and I've been really happy about it. Okay, here we go. Repetition, pattern, and variation. Those are my guiding principles that I brought from science. Pretty much that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Here are my details if you'd like to see more of my work online. And again, thank you to the Rife Gallery staff and for inviting me, and thank you for tuning in. There's a little while left to see the Quilt National at the Rife Center, and I encourage you all to get down there and see it. It's a remarkable show. Um, and again, thank you, Rife Gallery.
Well,
That's it.
thank you so much, Mary Lou. That was fabulous. I think it was so interesting. I love the beauty that comes out of those secondary patterns, out of the unexpected. I think that's so cool, especially when you think of science, of somebody having a science background, biology is something being very precise, but that's not necessarily the case, right? I think they're like you
Right.
said. So that was really, really interesting. We do have a few questions coming through, so we do have a few minutes for questions. If you have questions for Mary Lou, please put them in the chat. We'll do our best to get through all of them. So let's see, let's get started here. Building on the science, building on the science portion of that. So Camille asked, do you think that your approach to quilting is the same or similar approach to the way you approach a scientific problem or experiment?
I think very much so. I think every quilt is an experiment. I have steps that I take in order, and it is very much like an experiment to make a quilt. I know an awful lot of scientists become quilters that I know, a lot of women.
I was
I
curious about that. I think I know we've had some exhibitions at the Rife that were fiber arts and mathematics, and a lot of times artists
yes.
do have scientific backgrounds, and you don't necessarily think of those as worlds that might collide, but they seem to inevitably do. Can you talk a little bit more about like why maybe you were attracted to quilting?
Well, a lot of people think of science as kind of boring, as kind of following the rules and just doing the work. But science is really actually incredibly creative. Having those ideas and figuring out a way to maybe answer a question. Um, I think people kind of science gets a bad rap as being kind of, uncreative or boring. But I think the reasons I think that many women scientists and men, there's not a lot, but a few men, um, turn to quilting is because it is creative, it's problem solving, and it's following a set of, um, I don't know, rules, behavior, a set of steps, I would say, just like science does.
Fabulous. Talking a little bit, getting into details about technique, we had another
Mhm.
question in reference to the shibori dyed quilts. Is it
Mhm.
correct that there's no hand piecing needed, only quilting?
Uh, No hand pill. Y- you can hand piece. There's no problem with that. You can do, I just use a machine because it's faster essentially, and it's also sturdier. Handwork does tend to is not quite as sturdy as machine work. Um, I'm not sure if I understand the rest of the question. Can you say it again?
Emil, if you can further clarify that a little bit in the chat, that would be great. We'll try and get a deeper dive in that.
Hmm.
I do have a question, another technique question for you. When you were talking about your things fall apart
Yes.
pieces, and you were talking about the background and how you approached that and how you had to, can you talk a little bit more about that? That was fascinating, and I'm super curious to do a little bit of a deeper dive into that.
Okay. It is a similar effect as applique, but in fact, it makes the fabric lighter. This was an idea that I saw up at the Cleveland Museum years ago in a Shaw, I can't think of his name, a Shaw's tent, and it was huge, but everything was inset. It wasn't every piece of the tent was very ornate, and every piece was inset to make the tent lighter so that it could be transported. Um, and this inset idea is to cut the fabric, cut the piece that you're going to inset just a little bit larger, fold the edges together, sew it together, but it's in order to keep it flat, there's a couple little tricks that you have to use. Um, and I can, that's kind of a long story, but the whole point is to keep the fabric as flat as you can, but to, let's see, how would I put that? To mm, keep it from wrinkling, from buckling. Um, hmm, don't know quite what more to say about that. Uh, It's a little tricky technique, but it's very absorbing. You have to really concentrate to do it correctly, and I enjoy that part of it.
Linda is asking for a clarifying question. Can you describe what you mean when you say inset?
Yes, I mean, again, the two pieces are similar in size. The top piece is a little larger, so that you can have it. You can fold it under for a seam to the underlying piece. Okay, so it's actually, I don't know a word other than inset. Hmm. Oh, I wish I had a blackboard to show you.
It almost sounds like, is it correct to say it's almost like a puzzle piece, like a puzzle piece almost in the middle of a
Yes, very much like a
like
puzzle piece. Yes,
okay,
very much. That's great. The puzzle
okay,
piece is really a good one. Yeah.
great.
Okay. But you have seams then that lie flat underneath.
Wonderful. So it sounds like you like to challenge yourself, you like to give yourself kind of new projects, things that take a little extra time or things that are almost experiments in themselves in your
Yes,
artwork,
very
playing
much.
with transparency, your techniques. Like, how do you stay curious?
Mm. Well, I guess that comes from my science background also. You look around the world and you say, why did that happen? Or how did that happen on in any natural occurrence? And I say the same thing in when I look at art pieces. How did they do that? How could I do that a little differently? Um, it's just a matter of not being afraid to try something new, I think, and to stay engaged.
All right, well, we are coming up on our time here today. Before we go, I just want to ask, what's next? What's next
Uh,
for you?
Well, I thought that I was done with this Luminous series, but those little pixelated insets are kind of haunting me. So I think I'll continue with that for a little while. I've also been playing with some not natural dyes, but earth pigments that you mix with soy milk and apply to fabric for color. And that's kind of a process that I'm enjoying. I don't know quite what I'm going to do with those yet. They've mainly been pretty small pieces, maybe a couple feet square. But I might just start quilting with those too, as soon as I get the technique down. That will be, it's kind of a summer activity because it's messy and I have to do it outside. So I think that's what's next.
Well, that sounds exciting. Well, that does it for our time here today, Mary Lou. Thank you again so much for your generosity of your time and your talent. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today, and for joining us for this artist talk as part of our programming for Quilt National 2025, the best in contemporary quilts. I'd also like to give a special thank you to the Ohio Arts Council's board, the Ohio legislature, and the governor who support the OAC and this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thank you so much, everyone. We will see you next time.